Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on how to fight racism. The conversation that we're going to have is going to focus on two things, the ARC model and reparations. So we're going to look at the ARC model, which focuses on awareness, relationships, and commitment. And then we're going to talk about the issue of reparations. We're going to discuss the biblical rationale for reparations, and then we're going to talk about some ideas of civic reparations and ecclesiastical reparations. So how do you fight racism? By this point, we have discussed in great detail what exactly racism is, the fact that we live in a racialized society, and we've looked at the history of that and the complications involved in that. And I think what's really important as we ask this question, as we think this through, we should really stop and pause for a moment and think, how do you fight something like racism? I think the word fight is important because I don't think racism goes away passively. I think we have to think in terms of proactive behaviors. We have to think of fighting it, of working against it in some sort of active way. So, how do you do that? How do you fight racism? Bishop Ken Untener, Catholic bishop, in talking about a Catholic martyr, wrote what's called the Romero Prayer. And what he said was this: we cannot do everything. And there's a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that's the difference between being the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. I really like what Bishop Untener has written here. We can't do everything. And we have to realize that. And in some ways, that is liberating because it enables us to focus on simply doing something. I think the answer to that question on how to fight racism really begins with we just have to do something. We just have to be aware of the problem and do something about it. And that's different for different people. And then we have to recognize that this is a big problem. The movement towards being less racist of a society or away from racism totally is an incremental thing. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next week or probably next year or maybe even in the next 10 years. But if it occurs incrementally in all of us, we become prophets of a future that's not our own. We may never possess this future that we desire of a healthy, completely healthy racial society, but we can work towards that incrementally. And so, one of the ideas about how to do that is by use of what's called the ARC model. The idea of fighting racism essentially on three levels. The first level is the level of awareness. And the second level is the level of relationship building. And then the third level is the level of commitment or action. So I'm going to take these one at a time. Within the ARC model, what can we do to become more aware? Awareness is reading and learning more about the history, the racial history of the United States, trying to understand what we've been talking about in this class over several conversations. You can become aware by watching documentaries, reading books, and just being more in tune with how issues of race affect the world around you. You can become more aware by simply diversifying your social media feed to be able to see information from groups of people that are not like you, groups of people that have different ideas and different experiences. You can access websites and podcasts created by minorities. There's a number of terrific podcasts out there created by minority Christians who are speaking out on how do we look at race issues from a biblical perspective. There are other secular podcasts out there that help us to understand and frame the issues existing. But there's the thing about the world we live in today is you can access as much information as you can as you can put into yourself. There's plenty of information out there. We just have to go looking for it and make it part of our own personal experience and conversation. And then lastly, I think with regard to awareness, and Tisby talks about this at different times, and I think the Black Church really is good at drawing us to this, and some of the more liturgical Christian churches as well are good at drawing us towards this idea of lament, and that is the idea of really taking some time to process the the deep and disturbing history and the real experiences of people and the real tragedy of our racial experiences, and to lament that in a way that helps us to kind of think about how can we process this, uh, but also how can we move forward now. I think one of the problems that we have in America is that we have never truly lamented slavery. We've never truly lamented segregation as a nation, and in particular as a church as well. And you would think that we would have done that as a church, but I think there's room for that. There's room for more conversation about lamenting our history, and so that in a healthy way, we can then move forward together towards a better history. So the first level of the ARC model would be awareness, the need to be aware of our racial history and to take active measures to be aware of what's going on with regard to race and racism in our society today. The second part of the ARC model is relationships. The ARC model suggests that individuals who would like to see racial reconciliation in our country uh, make the effort to pursue meaningful interracial relationships. Now, there's lots of questions about this, and I think we should be careful in doing this because you might find yourself in a situation where you could inappropriately pursue an interracial relationship simply because, not because you want to have a relationship with somebody, but because they are a different race than you. And so we don't want to think in terms of using another person for our own benefit, but we do desire, and we should desire, meaningful interracial relationships. We should diversify our relationships, and we should do that in an intentional way. And so once we start to develop, again, meaningful interracial relationships, these are not short-term relationships, these are long-term relationships. This should be birthed out of a true desire to develop interracial relationships that are meaningful, healthy, and long-term. We should then, once you become involved in these kinds of relationships, I think you are able to get to the point uh, eventually of asking and sharing experiences and perspectives, asking others from other backgrounds and experiences to share their experiences and perspectives with you, and also being willing to share your own experiences and perspectives with others. Thirdly, relationships can be developed by finding new places to hang out that are diverse. One of the reasons we don't develop interracial relationships is often because we simply don't go places where the community is diverse. We stay in our own communities. Obviously, we have black churches, we have white churches. There are now, in the recent decades, many more multi-ethnic, multiracial churches out there, but that wasn't true of the past. So you can find places that are more diverse. You can go to places where a more diverse group of people is in community, and so that kind of requires an action. It requires being proactive. And sometimes that requires even thinking about moving. If you're really serious about some of the things we've been talking about in this class, you might think as life progresses and you are thinking about, where am I going to live? Or as you're even looking at where you live now and saying, you know what, where I live now doesn't give me diversity. It doesn't give me racial relationships. It doesn't help me to see and learn about other people. Maybe you got to move. Maybe you got to move to a different neighborhood or a different town. Maybe you need to take that sort of action to develop these relationships. But the second part of the ARC model is to be intentional about developing relationships with people that are have experiences and perspectives that are different from yours. The third level of the ARC model is commitment. So what do you do? What types of things can you do? Because it's real important, as I said earlier, racism is not going to go away with just one decision. It's a lot of little decisions that are incremental that we make over a long period of time that are going to make our society better. And so some commitments you can make. You can join an organization. You can join a civil rights organization. You can join an organization that's meant to help people that are suffering from injustices in society. You can donate money to organizations that do this type of work. You can go and request to speak with political candidates or your political representatives to get a sense of where they're at and to share where you're at on these issues. I think this is one area that we just don't do enough instead of responding to the issue of the moment, to simply take the time to make our elected officials know that this is our expectation, and also to find out from them what they're involved in and that we might not know of, and how we can be involved. Obviously, one of the commitments we can make is to vote and to be sensitive to issues that are important regarding racial injustice when we vote. Make that a very essential part of how we make our decisions with regard to voting. We can volunteer our time in organizations that are fighting racial injustice. And we can also know about issues that are involved in combating systemic injustice, the issues of systemic injustice and how to combat them. And in particular, things like criminal justice reform, getting at those issues that we talked about, where black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than a white police officer. And the most stunning statistic, that six and a half that a black person is 6.5 times more likely to be convicted and put in prison for a drug offense than a white person, even though blacks and whites essentially use and sell drugs at about the same rate. How can we get involved in that? Be thinking about those things. Be talking with people, be sharing that information, and be trying to figure out and work with other people on how to get after those systemic issues, how to make sure people have the right to vote. That's so important in our system, in our democratic republic. If people don't have the right to vote, if they aren't, if their voting is suppressed or discouraged in some way, that affects everything else in our society. And then lastly, to be thinking about the issue of reparations. And obviously, this is a highly controversial thing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But in general, in the ARC model, awareness, relationships, and then strong commitments. Do something, take action, make commitments over the long term to be part of the solution to this problem. So then the second part of our conversation today is about reparations. And so I want to ask this question: are reparations necessary? So when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about the idea that we should do something, that we should take some sort of action to repair the wrong that's been done. And so we're looking at 250 years of people being exploited for their labor and not being paid for their labor appropriately. Then we're looking at another 100 years of segregation and discrimination and disfranchisement, where people had limited access to property and education and jobs. Now, obviously, um, not all of those people um, are deceased, but the vast majority are deceased at this point. But the ones that are not deceased, the ones that are still living that experience some of this, or their children, their grandchildren, should we be talking as a society about reparations? Is that necessary? I think another question to ask is, can we move forward without reparations? That might be even a better way to ask this question. Can our society move forward um, as a free and equal biracial society without some sort of reparations? That's a very interesting question to think about. Anne Braden, in her outstanding book, The Wall Between, I strongly encourage you to get this book after you finish this course and read it. You will you will learn so much, and you will get a really, really solid and healthy perspective on the depth of the racial issues. She said this: men's hearts and minds, it was usually assumed, change slowly. Therefore, we could sit back, relax somewhat, and wait for a change to come about, perhaps giving it an occasional helpful nudge. But today, we don't have that kind of time. The places where the basic change must occur are the same, but more than a nudge is needed, and as a matter of fact, it is only under the impact of action that human hearts and minds are ever altered anyway. Only when some practical situation presents the necessity to think and feel in new ways, or at least to re-examine old beliefs. I think that's so true. Change comes about as a result of action. People tend to hold on to their beliefs, in particular, their bad beliefs, their bad thinking, their bad patterns. And what gets us out of those bad patterns is some sort of action. And I think reparations, even though a very tough conversation, is one worth having, at least on some levels. And it's worth engaging because it is something that pushes us forward in our thinking. And it's probably true that that's what we need above all else, is to be pushed forward in our thinking about what's happened and how we can move forward. Numbers 5:7 says, "Then they shall confess their sin, which they have done, and he shall recompense his trespass with the principal thereof, and add unto it the fifth part thereof, and give it unto him against whom he hath trespassed." So the Bible actually sets up in Numbers 5:7 the biblical premise of uh, reparations. And the idea here is, if you've wronged somebody, you need to restore everything that you have taken from that individual, plus 1/5. That is the restitution that the Bible actually requires in Numbers 5:7. So that helps us to have sort of a framework. It is a moral and biblical and Christian conversation for us to be engaged in. And so something I think very, very important to think about. So the biblical rationale for reparations comes out of Numbers 5:7, which says make full restitution and then add 1/5. It comes out of Daniel 9:8, because one of the questions that we ask is like, well, I didn't particularly take from a person. I didn't own a slave. I didn't deny somebody the right to vote. I didn't do this. Maybe society did it, or maybe my ancestors did it. Well, Daniel 9:8 says, our ancestors are covered with shame. Um, it kind of brings up the issue that there's a healthy way of feeling the shame of the actions of our ancestors. I think that's important to think about. If you are benefiting today from something because of the bad actions of your parents or your grandparents, I think that's something that the Bible would require us to stop and think through, and to really, really kind of come to terms with, because there's lots of moral issues involved here, and not just taking responsibility for our own actions, but for actions others have taken, in particular the ones that have benefited us or just harmed somebody else, and those persons are somehow connected to us. And then Matthew 5:24 says, first, before you come offer your sacrifice or your gift, go and be reconciled to those who you are not reconciled to those who have differences with you. I think that's a really fundamental Christian principle, that if there are people in society that feel harmed by you, not just because of you personally, but because you are part of a group, I think it's reasonable to think that we might have Christian responsibility to go and attempt to be reconciled, and maybe reparation is one of the ways that we can engage that conversation. So there are two types of reparations that we can think about. The first is civic reparation. This is the idea of the government doing something to fix the problem or to repair the problem. Again, probably not fixable in totality, but how can we repair the problem? One of the most obvious ways is home ownership programs, ways to help minorities go from 40% home ownership to 70% home ownership, the way white Americans experience home ownership, or the rate that white Americans experience home ownership in this country. Something like offering, and some places are doing this, they're buying up homes that were part of those Levitt towns that were denied to black veterans, and they're finding descendants of those black veterans, and the city is buying up the homes and then offering at really good 1950s type prices mortgages to help people that were ancestors of people that were denied, or descendants of people that were denied those loans, to get a house of their own. Uh, Maybe we could think about pardons for past minor or drug related offenses, as we have seen this skewed situation with incarceration and the incredible damage that is done to minority communities. Maybe we can look at pardons, because as we know, these offenses often cause people problems later in life. Maybe we could start addressing those systemic issues. Uh, Maybe we could remove restrictions entirely, or in large part with regard to employment for former prisoners. So there are many different things that we can think about with regard to civic reparations. Obviously, continuing to combat the systemic issues, but these are more direct things that we can do to undo past negative or immoral or wrong actions that we have taken against certain groups in our society. The other kind of reparation is what we call ecclesiastical reparation. What can the church do? The Bible talks about food sharing ministries. I think that is a good principle and something I personally am involved in. The Bible talks about debt forgiveness. Maybe the church could be an organization that's working to help minorities get rid of debts and be forgiven for debts, and to kind of get a fresh slate. In the Bible, every so many years in the Old Testament, people were granted debt forgiveness and a fresh start. We don't have that in our society. Maybe the church can be in the lead on that. Maybe the church could be part of encouraging Christians to donate inherited properties to minorities. You know, if you are one of those 70% that owns your own home and you inherit the home of a family member, and you already have a home, you already have your own home, maybe people can start thinking in terms of organizations that the Christian organizations that take inherited properties and try to figure out how to offer them at maybe low down payments, maybe no interest at all, uh, to allow minorities to be able to move into home ownership. Some really good ideas to think about there. Ecclesiastical reparations could involve funding Black organizations. Churches that are in wealthy suburbs could take some resource and fund uh, minority churches that are in poor neighborhoods. Now, not all minority churches are in poor neighborhoods, obviously, but maybe this could be true of minority churches as well that are in wealthy areas. Supporting organizations, churches, different groups that are working to deal with racial injustice. Um, and again, the church taking the lead on that. And then lastly, the church may be taking the lead for tuition support for Black students, for minority students attempting to go to school. Again, to try to correct the past um, discrimination against people from being able to enter education like everyone else. So there's lots of different ideas, and there are more ideas, obviously, that we could talk about that the church can be involved in and individual Christians can be involved in with regard to the concept of reparation. So in this conversation, we've talked about two things. We talked about the ARC model, the importance of fighting racism by becoming aware, by building relationships and making strong commitments to take some sort of action. Incremental action, um, a bunch of incremental action will add up to significant action over time. And being patient in that as well and thinking long term commitments to making a better society when it comes to the conversations about racial injustice and inequality. And then the most active thing we can do is talk about reparations. I understand the biblical rationale that exists for reparations, and then think in terms of what can we encourage the government to do with regard to repairing some of the situation, the past actions, past injustices as best we can, and also ecclesiastical or church or individual Christian-based reparations where we take action ourselves as our own entities to say, what can we do to repair past injustices? So some questions to consider with regard to this conversation. What should Christians be cognizant of when pursuing interracial relationship for the purpose of racial reconciliation? I think there needs to be some deep thinking about that. So that's something to really stop and think about. What are the moral implications of refusing to address systemic issues? What are the moral implications of just saying we are not going to ever address these systemic issues? Can we ever move to a free and equal biracial society without addressing those issues? And then lastly, should Christians support reparations? Why or why not? Thanks for joining the conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.